Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Adam Alter is an assistant professor of marketing and psychology at New York University's Stern School of Business and Psychology. His work has been widely published in academia and has been featured in the mainstream media on PBS, BBC, and in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and The Economist. He has a PhD from Princeton. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks to all of you for having me. It's terrific to be here. I'm very excited about speaking to you all. And I just want to start by giving you a sense of my background very briefly, just to give you a sense of where I've come from and why I wrote this book. I studied law and psychology as an undergrad in Australia, and then I moved to the US to do a PhD in psychology, in social and cognitive psychology. And I very quickly became really interested, partly because I was interested in the law, in how we make decisions. How does someone decide whether to commit a wrongful act? And often the answers are not that interesting, but sometimes they are interesting, and they're interesting because people don't have great access to the origins of those decisions. And so I started to study human judgment and decision making, and in particular I was interested in all these forces that act on us without our recognizing that they're having those effects. And that's really what Drunk Tank Pink is all about. It's this subtitle, The Unexpected Forces That Shape How We Think, Feel and Behave, that sums up my interest in humans, how they make the decisions they do, and why they think the things they do. And I'm going to share a few anecdotes, little chunks from within the book with you today. And then at the end, I'd love to take some questions, because I think that's often where the most interesting stuff happens. So before I do that, just to give you a sense of how I think of the mind, there are so many metaphors for the mind. People talk about the mind as a telephone exchange or as a computer. The one that I like the best for the purposes of today's talk is that the mind is basically an iceberg, and you have access to the stuff above the surface of conscious awareness, and that it turns out that there's a lot less there than you might think. So from above it looks like everything is there, contained there, but of course, just like an iceberg, much of what's interesting is actually below the surface of conscious awareness. The job of Drunk Tank Pink, or of my job in creating Drunk Tank Pink, is to try to populate the bit of the iceberg below, to try and understand why this part happens to be this shape, this part happens to be this shape. And I'm going to argue with the book that a lot of what shapes the iceberg as it is this stuff around us and its impact on how we think, feel, and behave. So just to start, I want to give you a sense of why I call the book Drunk Tank Pink. Drunk Tank Pink is a color, and it's an emblem, I think, for a lot of the effects that I talk about in the book. It's this bright pink, I don't know if that came out quite right, but it's a bright pink, bubblegummy Pepto-Bismol color. If you could see the screen as I see it here, it looks like the worst antibiotic you had to take as a kid. So that bright pinkish, sickening color. And the color came to prominence in the 60s at first. Psychologists, I see some of you have been reading the book, and so that means you probably started with the prologue, which means that you read a little bit about this. But psychologists in the 60s in parts of Canada were very interested in trying to determine whether if you changed the colors of the walls in a room, you could change the behavior of the students. Could you lead them to behave better? And that's where the original use of the color came in. What they did was they went into a series of classrooms and they painted those classrooms a series of different colors. And then they measured whether that had any effect on the behavior of the students. It was reasonably scientific, but it wasn't as rigorous as we'd like it to be, as scientists like these things to be usually. And they had theories about all these different colors, that blue might be associated with the tranquility of the sea or the sky. Green would remind them of nature and the organic nature of trees and greenery. And so that might make them a little more creative and a little bit more relaxed. Yellow should make them feel more engaged, vibrant, interested. And pink, they weren't really sure what to make of pink, but they tried it anyway. And it turns out that's the color that stuck the best. The best responses came from this color pink, because the rowdy students in the classroom who were most disruptive turned out to be a lot less so in the presence of this color pink. That's pretty striking, but obviously we don't have enough evidence just from that one study to make strong claims about this color. And so they started to do some more rigorous studies to see whether they could show that this color pink had systematic effects on human behavior. So one of the first studies was run on 153 men, healthy men, and what they were asked to do was to stare at a piece of pink cardboard, just a pretty small piece of pink cardboard, and to stare at that cardboard for a minute. And after that, they were asked to grip what is called a hand grip dynamometer, which basically measures your grip strength. And then it shows on a digital scale how hard you're gripping with your hand. So they had these men look at the pink cardboard for a minute and then grab the dynamometer and grip it as hard as possible. And then they had them repeat that with blue cardboard. Some people did it in that order. Some people looked at the blue cardboard first. Obviously, you need to counterbalance these things because you'll get weaker over time. But the results were pretty striking. What they found was among those 153 people, every single one of them, except for 2, was stronger after looking at the blue cardboard than at the pink cardboard, which is a striking effect. In social science research, in this sort of human performance research, that's a huge, huge, huge effect. It's unusual to find such a strong effect. And so they started to talk about this a little more widely. They shared it with the media. It started to take off in popular culture in all sorts of different settings. So the reason it has its other name, Drunk Tank Pink, is more officially known as Baker Miller Pink. The names Baker and Miller are the names of 2 naval officers who worked at a correctional facility that happens to be quite near here. It was in Seattle. And what they did was they saw a talk about this color, and they decided that they too would paint the inside of jail cells, a couple of their drunk tanks, this color. And the idea was that they would pacify the prisoners who came in, the most rowdy and dangerous prisoners. They'd throw them in there for 15 minutes and they would come out 15 minutes later, pacified, less aggressive, tranquilized, better behaved. And across a 9-month period, they reported that even though they had regular incidents, when they put the prisoners in this cell for 15 minutes, they didn't have a single incident afterwards, which is another striking effect. And then football coaches got wind of this. And at the University of Iowa, they decided that they would paint the visitors' locker room this color to try to pacify their opponents. So the idea was that before the game started, their opponents would walk into this visitors' locker room. They would see this bright pink color, and they would be weakened by that. Since it weakened prisoners and it weakened guys who are holding hand grips, it would weaken the football players as well. And then at halftime, when normally they would get jazzed for the second half, they actually emerged weaker again. And this is an idea. And in fact, the University of Iowa still looks like this. The visitor locker room is still this pink color. So Drunk Tank Pink gained a lot of currency. And there are some questions about the effect today. People question why the effect emerged. Is it something biological? Do we respond to that particular color? Is it something about the association we have with the color pink? There's quite a lot of research suggesting all sorts of alternatives. And I talk about a little bit of that in the opening of the book. I think it's a nice emblem for the effects that I talk about in the book because it arose up from nowhere. People couldn't believe that something as innocuous as a color could have such powerful effects, and yet it seems to have those effects. At least there's some evidence for those effects. It's also quite complex. There are multiple reasons why it might be happening. It might partly be biological, and I talk about a lot of biological effects in the book. Or it's possible that it's about the association we have between the color pink and various things like perhaps weakness or femininity. And so there are a whole lot of different alternative explanations for that, and I think those come up time and again in the book. And what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about each of the sections of the book. So I talk about these cues in 3 sections. The first is the world within us. This is the stuff that resides in our heads where we don't need to interact with other people. It's enough just for us to have processed the information in isolation. Things like the names we call things, the language we use to describe things, the symbols we see around us, logos, icons. Then I'm going to talk about the world between us. So this is a little bit broader. The world first resides in your head and then it resides between us. What does it matter that there are a certain number of people in this room and a certain number of people watching online? Does that make a difference? If I were delivering this talk to an empty room, would that matter? If this room were filled with 20,000 people, if it were more than just a room, if it were a stadium, would that matter? Obviously, the answer there is yes, and I explore those questions in the second part of the book, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then in the final part, I talk about the physical world, and that's where color comes in, the weather, locations, and the world around us, the world that surrounds all of us, not just between us and not just within us, but also around us. So starting with the world inside us, or the world within us, I want to talk a little bit about names and the names we give people and places and things and objects. In the 1980s, a Belgian social psychologist ran a study where he asked people who spoke a whole lot of different languages. Some of them spoke English, some German, some Russian, some Greek, using all sorts of different languages and different alphabets. He asked them, please circle your 6 favorite letters of the alphabet, which is a weird question. People don't often ask you what your favorite letter is. It's a strange question to ask. But you probably do, if pushed, have favorites. And if you're like many, many people, one of your favorites, assuming you have a reasonable degree of self-esteem and don't hate your name, one of your favorites will be your initial. Your first initial and maybe your last. In my case, A is both my first and last initial. So I really like A. And this is sort of an idly interesting effect. It reflects self-esteem in a way that you might not expect to find it in the world at large. But it also has major implications for policy. And this is something that I talk about in the book that hadn't really been discussed much before. But when you stumble on these effects, these systematic biases that we have, you can then capitalize on them in, I think, quite interesting ways. So we know that people name each other and we name children. We also name some other things in the world. One of the things we happen to name is hurricanes. We identify, and have done since the mid-1950s, hurricanes by a certain name. So on the left here we have Hurricane Katrina, and on the right we have Hurricane Rita. These were 2 of the very severe hurricanes during the 2005 record-breaking hurricane season. Terrible hurricanes that did immense damage. You probably recognize Katrina, maybe not so much Rita, but it turns out that these were 2 of the very, very damaging hurricanes from that season. And one question is, does it matter that they were named Katrina and Rita? Should it matter? What if we gave them slightly different names? Would that matter? Would there be any material outcome there, or change in any material outcome if we did? And it turns out that yes, it is important what we name these hurricanes. When you ask the Weather Service why they name certain hurricanes with certain names, they say, well, what happened in the 50s was we found it was just difficult to keep naming hurricanes after the location where they struck because we didn't know where they were going to strike until they actually arrived. And so then we used latitude and longitude, but of course people don't really know what to make of latitude and longitude. Most people don't have any sense of what that means. And so they began using these arbitrary names selected and placed on a list alphabetically. So imagine that Katrina and Rita come by, they do a lot of damage, and then you want to assemble a team of celebrities. And you decide that you want these 2 teams of celebrities. Team 1 will deal with one of the hurricanes and try to raise money. You'll perhaps ask them to donate. And Team 2 will deal with the other hurricane. Let's say this is your team. First team is Team Green. Here are your celebrities. This is Team Blue. The question is, would it matter which group of celebrities you assigned to each hurricane? And if so, why should it matter? Does anyone notice anything that distinguishes the green team from the blue team?
First letter of the name.
Yeah, the first letter of their name. And in fact, for these 2 on the ends here, you've got Kevin Kline and Ryan Reynolds. Like Adam Alter, these are, they especially identify with these initials. And so if you look again, you can see these people all have names that start with R, these with K. And so they align with those hurricanes in an interesting way. You've got Team K for Katrina, Team R for Rita. And researchers have shown that when a hurricane shares your initial and then aid agencies seek disaster relief aid, people will donate much more to hurricanes that happen to share their initials. People are 2.5 times more likely to donate to Katrina, well, they were if they had K initials, and to Rita if they had R initials. And in fact, that's true across a whole raft of major hurricanes over the last 12 years or so, which the experimenters showed. So what can we do with this? This is an extension of that basic effect showing that names matter. Well, there are a few things we can do with it. One is to look at the way American names work and how different letters are more or less likely to appear as initials in the American taxonomy of names. And what you find if you look at the census is that it does matter. And I'm going to represent the relative frequency of names beginning with these by size. So this is obviously assuming that each letter is equally represented. Here is what it actually looks like when you look at the distribution. J's are very common. In fact, 10% of all males have names that begin with J. M is very common, particularly among women. And then you can see A, C, D, R, S are also common, T is common, and then others are less common. And if you zoom in on something, on a letter like O, there are names that begin with O. And in fact, these are names that hurricanes will have, but they're much less common, O names. And so the question is, what should we do with this? Given that we have all this information, when you put it together, how do we attract as much hurricane aid as we possibly can by renaming hurricanes? Is this something we can do? And the same is true of the names that we're currently using. Here are the 21 names for the 2013 hurricane season. As each storm becomes a tropical storm and then a hurricane, it'll attract the first name, then the second, then the third, and so on. And we'll do that for 6 years in a row and then return to this list. And the question is, are these well-chosen names? Based on what we know of human psychology, are they well chosen? And there are some heads shaking, and so the answer is no, they aren't ideally chosen. And the best way to represent this is the same way as I represented before. We'll take these names and again show the relative frequency of these names. If people are attracted to their initials and they identify with their initials, they probably will do the same with their names. And you can see here which names are more or less common. Just cycling between them, Melissa, Jerry, and Karen are very common. Some of these names, though, this name that you can't really see here is Sebastian, spelled with an E. Here's Van. Whoop, down here is obviously a much less common name. So based on what we know, if Hurricane Van happened to do the damage that Hurricane Katrina did, we'd be really missing out on a great opportunity. Perhaps it should have been named something that attracted more attention and that tapped into a greater segment of the US population. It's the basic argument. And in fact, you could name these hurricanes better keeping the gender the same. I've now rescaled that, and now using that same scale, if we'd named the hurricanes with these names, this is how much of the population we would have tapped into. So compared to these sizes here, James, Mary, David, Elizabeth, these are names that attract a greater proportion of the population, or that match a greater proportion of the population. And when you crunch all the numbers across time and you look at the 27 most damaging hurricanes for the last 13 years, this is what you find. That we've attracted about $10 billion in aid. That effect that I just talked about, this name letter effect for donating to hurricanes, accounts for about $500 million in aid of that $10 billion. $500 million comes because we identify with our names. If that effect were not a part of human psychology, we would have only attracted $9.5 billion. Which it's only 5% less, but $500 million is a lot of money. If we had perfectly named them as they should have been named according to this approach, and there are other considerations. I'm not saying this is how we should structure the policy, but certainly this is something to at least think about. If we optimize the situation, we would have attracted an extra $700 million in aid, which is striking, right? This is an inexpensive intervention. It costs nothing. To rename hurricanes, the Weather Service just has to pass, I guess, some sort of internal motion. They'll name the hurricanes differently, and all of a sudden aid should increase. And over a 12-year period or 13-year period, only looking at 27 of the most damaging storms, that amounts to $700 million for free. So this is one illustration of how tweaking an effect can change how the world works and how our thinking is shaped by this factor that you would never imagine would shape how much you're willing to give to a hurricane. The need of people during a hurricane doesn't change because you happen to share the initial of that hurricane's name, and yet you get these profound effects. The question is, at an individual level, this is great for policymakers, but what does this mean for you as an individual? How should you deal with this? There are a few things you should look for in a name. One of those things, and this is where a lot of my research focuses, is fluency. You should try and make the name as fluent as possible or easy to pronounce as possible. The test to use to determine this is, imagine that you're at the Oscars and you have to read this person's name out. How easy is it to read their name as you open the envelope? And you've seen this when someone opens an envelope at the Oscars and they struggle. So another way of thinking of the test is the 191 variants of Catherine. Turns out it's one of the names with the most variants, and here are some of them. So you can have fluent versions of Catherine and disfluent versions of Catherine. So an excellent version is Katrina, actually. Turns out that obviously shares the name of the hurricane. A slightly less excellent version is this one. It's still pronounced roughly the same, I think. But then this not-so-good version, it's a variant of the same name, but the argument is that you should choose the more fluent one. And the reasons are many, but here's one reason. If you look at lawyers, this is some research I did with some colleagues in Australia. If you look at how long it takes them to reach partnership, it turns out that their name matters a lot. The fluency of their name really matters. So if we get people to do the Oscar test where they're looking at the names of lots of lawyers, We say, imagine you've opened the envelope, you're about to pronounce this person's name. How easy or difficult is that? And we say, these are the people with the disfluent names, these are the people with the fluent names, and then we look at how long it takes them to make partner when they leave grad school, law school. What you find is after 3 years, we don't have any whiz kids here, and none of them are yet partners in the firms. After 8 years, a gap has opened up. The fluently named lawyers are more likely to be partners. In the middle part of their career, it seems that there's a slight advantage for the fluently named lawyers. And that persists into the late middle part of their career. Well, not late, but more middle part of their career. And so, again, this gap has widened up. There's a 9% difference. And then that gap actually closes at the 16th year. And what this tells us is that people who have fluent names will rise up more quickly, but it's not because they're better lawyers. Eventually, the same proportion will become partners. It's just that it takes them less time to get there. And there are all sorts of potential reasons for this. One is that when people walk in the door on the first day and they're met by a partner, and the partner's trying to decide who to put on a team or work with, the fluently named lawyer will be more likely to be chosen, all else being equal. A second alternative is that we just feel a little bit better. We feel somehow more comfortable with fluent names. And there's a lot of research that suggests that as well. And so we feel when we meet someone a little bit more comfortable when we can pronounce their name easily. So fluency is one thing to aim for. The same is true for financial stocks. We looked at the performance of stocks when they entered the markets following their IPOs. And what you find is in the week after the IPO, this is a very easy to pronounce name. This is a very hard to pronounce name. And this is the performance of the stock. This is obviously appreciation. And this is depreciation. This is just after 1 day. This is what you can expect based on how easy it is to pronounce your name. If the stock has an easy name, it'll do much better. You'll get a great pop. And if it has a very difficult to pronounce name, all else being equal, controlling for all sorts of things. The same is true of those names, controlling for foreignness, unusualness, how common the letters are, all that sort of stuff. And the same for the stocks, controlling for industry type. When you control for all that other stuff, fluency is still a very powerful factor. Yes?
So has there been any research to show whether there's a similar effect with product names and company names based on the number of syllables that it has in the name? I definitely see 2-syllable names reference a lot more than 3-syllable names, which of course is a problem at Microsoft.
I don't know of any research looking at syllables, but I could imagine there being effects. And there will always be exceptions, like Microsoft. But yeah, I imagine there would be a similar effect. And I think it's strongly correlated with fluency. So a name with many syllables is probably harder to pronounce as well, in general. All right, I'll push ahead there. But I'm happy to take questions at any time. If you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to do that. Yes?
There's a question from online, and you sort of just answered it.
Sure.
He's basically saying, please define fluency.
Sure.
Because he mentions ethnic bias, he mentions geographic distribution.
Yes, it's a good question. Fluency is the subjective sense that we have of subjective ease or difficulty associated with processing information. What that means is a name that you've never encountered before will be more disfluent than the same name in a year. So the name Barack Obama is now fluent to everyone. It's been pronounced so many times that we now, you see it on a page, and if it had to be drawn out of a hat for some award, it would be very easy to pronounce. There'd be no trouble with that. So it is subjective. It is a Polish name with lots of consonants in a row would be very disfluent to an American, but less so to a Pole, and so on. So it is bound by culture, by language. Yes?
Hi, my name is Crispin, and I can tell you from experience that the performance curve of that name when you're trying to be a school child is way different than when you're trying to build a publication record as a professor.
Right. And you're saying it's better as a professor than as a school child?
Yes.
Yes, it's an excellent point.
When you're trying to stand out in research, it's great.
Yeah.
Everyone knows who you are.
The uniqueness factor is a different factor, and it is also relevant. This controls for as many things as possible, including uniqueness. So we feed that into a model, and Crispin would do very nicely on uniqueness. And I think actually fluency as well. It's not too bad.
No one can spell it.
No one can spell it, so that's a problem as well. That's tied to fluency. But I think you're right. And in fact, we've shown that people like and think of writers as more intelligent when they can read what they've written more easily. So when a book is easy to read, that's great, except if you think the person is a lawyer. So context matters a lot. So for a school kid, You want to be as simple and clear as possible. And yes, when you graduate and then you enter the world, uniqueness then becomes valuable, whereas it was a real cost. And it made things harder for you when you were younger. I believe that, certainly. Yeah.
So this chart is really fascinating. There's such a direct correlation that it seems like it's almost purely driven, like the stock performance is almost purely driven by how easy it is to pronounce the name. Like literally people on Wall Street are deciding whether or not to invest in these companies based on how easy it is to pronounce the name and zero other factors, just looking at the data. But I mean, that's scarier than anything else that we talked about.
But this is just one day after IPO.
But does that mean that company is already popular? That's why it is easier to pronounce that?
Yeah, I mean, we control for all of that stuff as far as possible. But yes, the effect, what the model spits out, the effect is a powerful effect. When you take everything else out, it still seems to be a very powerful effect. And this is what you can expect based just on the fluency of the name. So yes, and it is extremely worrying, and I think that's what's partly so interesting about it. I want to push ahead. Please hold on to your questions if you've got more about this section, because I want to talk about some other stuff as well. But I'm glad you're engaged with this, and I'm happy to come back to it later on. Just a couple of examples of real stocks. Capital American did very nicely. The Hungarian telecommunications company named this did not do as well, and in fact went bust quite quickly. So examples, just a couple of examples, illustrative examples, but perhaps extreme examples. Of course, there's a foreignness effect here, and we control for the home bias, which is a big factor in investing. People don't like to invest in what's foreign, but we control for that by looking just at American stocks, and you get the same effect, although it is a little bit weaker. A second thing to look for in names is the symbolism of the name. And Microsoft actually has, you may not know this, but some very good features, some strong features, and I'll tell you what those are. Turns out that names map onto geometric shapes. So we're all synesthetes in some way. If I told you that one of these shapes was a maluma, which one would it be? Hands up if you think it's the one on the left. Okay, so almost everyone in the world will tell you that this is a maluma and this is a Teketi, weirdly. There's no inherent reason for that, but it's a very powerful effect, and that the illusion that there is some correspondence is very powerful as well. The same with Buba, that's on the left, Kiki is on the right. And this actually matters for all sorts of reasons. One thing it matters for is masculinity and femininity. If you had to name one of these children Teketi and the other Maluma, it would be pretty clear which is which. And the Portia hypothesis makes use of this. Portia was a character in The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, who wanted to appear before the court, but because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to, and she had to dress up as a man. And it turns out that that reflects a real property in the world of law. In South Carolina, some researchers looked at how judges rose to the bench, to judgeship. And what they found was that women who happened to have names that were shared more by men than names that were shared more by women. So, for example, the name Jennifer is almost exclusively a woman's name. The name Leslie is a name that's, some men have that name and some women have that name. If you have the name Leslie and you're a woman, you're more likely to become a judge and more quickly. That's the Portia hypothesis. So controlling for all sorts of other factors, the name really matters. The symbolism, the masculinity of that name seems to overcome some of the gender bias in the legal system. Yeah.
Is that across all cultures, the same sounds map to the same shapes?
Yes.
Okay.
It's incredibly robust.
Wow.
It's very robust, yeah. And it turns out that also matters for companies. You've got Kellogg's with a hard K sound, and Coca-Cola, and Microsoft, and Cat, and Costco. There's pretty good evidence that companies with these hard K sounds in them tend to do disproportionately well. And if you look at the top 200 companies, this was a study done some time ago, but the results persist. A pretty big number of the top 200 are companies that start with K or have that hard K sound in them. These are the ones that have the hard K sound in them. That is a greater, that's an overrepresentation of that sound relative to the population of names and words at large, which only have about 7% of them or 4% of words that have that hard K sound. And this is the reason why Eastman named Kodak Kodak, because he said the sound was so strong. You want to begin the name with a strong K, end it with a strong K. And so Kodak was the most dominant name he could come up with. And That seems to at least reflect something, some property in these companies. Perhaps they just had smarter people naming them and then they ended up doing better. I'm not saying it's causal, but there's an interesting relationship there. So that's all I want to say about the world within us. I'm going to briefly talk about the world between us. I don't want to spend as much time on this, but I'll tell you of one really, I think, quite interesting effect. And this is an effect in the domain of chess. This is Vladislav Kachov. He's a chess grandmaster. In 2009, his world rank was 58, so he's a very serious chess player. And he's actually the world champion, or was for a number of years, at blitz chess, a game that you play much more quickly. There are different versions. You can either play 5-minute chess or 1-minute chess, where the moves are made very, very quickly. He's something of a playboy in the world of chess as well. He's been known to show up to certain matches drunk and to fall asleep halfway through the game. This has happened on a number of occasions. The other thing he's known for is for introducing the World Chess Beauty Contest. He basically decided that it wasn't fair that we only thought of chess players as all mental brawn and no beauty. And so he decided that he would invite all of the female chess grandmasters to enter the so-called World Chess Beauty Contest. And that's what he did. And there is plenty of beauty in the world of chess. It may not be the place you'd think of first when thinking of a repository for beauty, but this is Carmen Kass. She's the greatest player that Estonia has had for a long time now. She was the chairwoman of the Estonian Chess Federation. This is Carmen playing chess. The question is, does it matter if you're facing Carmen rather than anyone else? Just a run-of-the-mill person. How would you play chess differently? What if you were playing against a computer or Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest players of all time? Does it matter who is sitting across from you? And Kachov, the guy that I just showed you before, described playing against Kasparov as though he were playing against someone who was 10 foot tall, and all he could think of when he made every move was how big and overwhelming this guy was. The question is, what would it matter if you're playing against an attractive female opponent? And so some researchers asked that question, and what they thought was, chess players are hyper-rational. They are about as rational as people come, and if they're very good at what they do, they should do a very good job of processing all the information properly. They should have a strategy that they should stick to. And so you shouldn't see too much deviation. If ever you are not going to see deviation based on biases, it should be in this world where the very best chess players are playing important games. So what they did was they looked at games across time. These are photos taken from a website called Hot or Not. I don't know if you know this site. Based on that response you do. If you take all of the lowly ranked faces and average them, you get this face. And if you take a whole lot of the very highly ranked faces and average them, you get this face. That's from some research. Question is, would it matter playing against this stylized person on the left or the stylized person on the right? And it turns out it really does matter. So in games between 1997 and 2007, heterosexual men who were playing against women, this is what they found. When they were playing against a less attractive female opponent, they had many more conservative draws. So they played a much more conservative, staid kind of chess, which is the standard kind of chess. When they played against attractive women, they lost more often, and often because they took insane risks that they would never normally take. It was like they were showing off, flaunting their resources, doing a great job of showing that resource-wise, let's go back to the prairies that we roamed along when we were thousands and thousands of years ago and many generations ago. It's like they went right back there. Take the rational brain that is playing chess, throw it right all the way back to generations ago when we were trying to just impress the women on the prairie. And these guys started to behave like that in front of the attractive women. And so they lost more often, but occasionally they won in spectacular fashion because they tried moves that had never been tried before for good reason, because they were a bad idea. The same is true of their opening gambits. So I think a fascinating effect. You take the most rational men in the world that you can find, and we can argue about that. It's a bit stylized for the example. But these are very rational people who have pretty good strategies that they normally turn to. And even they are swayed by the presence of other people, in particular attractive women. Yes?
Yes, sir. Two questions into one. How much of this would you put towards evolutionary psychology, and how much towards Vygotsky's theories about cultural socialization?
Good question. They don't really know. So it could be, there are multiple reasons why this might be happening. One is that it's biological, and that's I think people like to favor that explanation because it's a little sexier and more interesting. The other alternative is that culturally we just think that's the way we deal with people who look a certain way, that we've scaffolded over time, and when we greet new people, we use existing theories that we have about the way the world works. And so when you greet an attractive woman as a man, you're supposed to do certain things. I think there's pretty good evidence that that's not going on. They asked a lot of questions of these chess players, and they have of others who swear that they are not doing anything like that. This is not going on. I'm not treating them any differently. I don't think I should accord them any leniency or anything like that, which would be consistent with Vygotsky. But the biological part is there. And in fact, if you look at testosterone levels, which they've done in other experiments, that the rise in testosterone that comes when you're attracted to someone is correlated with this idiocy, risky, ill-advised behavior, which suggests some serious biological links. So that's all I want to talk about in the world between us. There's a lot more in the book, but that's all I'll talk about now here. And I'll turn to the last part now, the world around us. And I want to focus on nature as a buffer against stress. Because I think for me, when I was researching the book, this was one of the effects that I found most profound and striking. And it's one, people ask me all the time, have you changed the way you live based on this stuff? The answer is really not so much. But this is one thing that I've thought about a lot, especially living in the middle of Manhattan, which is a place that doesn't have much nature to offer. My view is buildings, pretty buildings, but buildings, and really mainly just the walls of pretty buildings. So the argument is, if this little ant represents us with a stressor, can nature come between us and that source of stress? And I think it can, and I'll tell you about how that might be. And my favorite experiment on this was conducted in the late 70s and early 80s at a hospital in Pennsylvania called Paoli Memorial Hospital. And what happened at this hospital was people had gallbladder surgery over time, which was a fairly routine procedure, but it takes a bit of time to recover from it. It's now done arthroscopically, so the incision is very small, but at the time it was a much bigger operation. And they had 24 people in 2 different groups, and they matched these people, which means that if we take person 24 in each group, they were matched on as many features as possible. This one was male, 25, smoked about 10 cigarettes a day and didn't exercise. The one in the other group was male, 24 years old, smoked about 12 a day, no exercise. They're pretty similar. Their medical histories are the same. Their behavior patterns are the same. Their exercise levels are the same. So they're all matched up to someone in each group. But the groups differ in one very important way, and that is that this is the hospital from above. This is a bird's eye view, and this is the way the recovery rooms work. They're all structured along this long corridor that goes along here. And these are their rooms with windows that look out. And what you have is a stand of trees here. It's not beautiful, but there are some trees, and that's, something natural to look at. That's more appealing than something that isn't natural to look at. What you find is that the people in this group 1 happen to be in rooms that looked out onto a brick wall. The people in group 2 happened to be in rooms where they were looking out onto the stand of trees. That was the only difference between them. They had the same nurses and the same doctors. They had exactly the same configuration of room. The only difference was what they saw when they looked out the window. So these people are looking out at the brick wall. These are looking out at a natural view, the stand of trees. And what they found, the researcher found, it's actually just one researcher, is that between days 2 and 5, this is when you've come out of the anesthetic, when you experience, if you're going to experience pain, it'll be during these days. People in group 1 who looked at the brick wall required on average 6.5 doses of heavy painkiller, but only 2.5 for those in group 2, a little bit more than 2.5. So they required much less help from painkillers than did people who were looking out at brick walls. It's as though nature was, to some extent, a painkiller for them. The other thing that was interesting was how long it took them to recover. It takes a few days for people to recover, but by day 6, some of them start to leave. And what you find is that they leave more quickly from group 2, that by looking out at a natural view, they were leaving much more rapidly. And by day 8, half of them in group 2 had left, and by 10, all of them in group 2 had left, and there were still 6 patients from group 1 who were in the hospital. And again, the only difference that people could isolate was this difference in view. There was no other apparent difference. Of course, that's a study with 48 people. It's not a huge study, and it's a lot to conclude based on that one study. And since then, there have been many, many studies that have shown the same thing. One study looked at children who had experienced great stress as children, and they were much better off. They were much better able to fight off that stress and to do better later in life if they had a backyard with greenery, this controlling for socioeconomic status, for wealth and all of that. Backyard with greenery, even pot plants in the home made a difference. So there are some very striking effects of nature on buffering against stress. But that's not the only feature. Nature is not the only feature of environments that shapes how we think, feel, and behave and adjust and flourish. This is Manhattan. This is part of Manhattan called Washington Heights. Is anyone from Manhattan? Anyone from New York? Okay, so this is a part of Manhattan. It's actually the only part where there is a big interstate that goes through. This is it. It comes off the George Washington Bridge from New Jersey and right through the northern part of Manhattan, through Washington Heights. I-95 is one of the noisiest roads in all of America. And unfortunately for the people who live in these 4 buildings, these buildings are on top of I-95, literally, not just like next to, but they are built over. There is a tunnel, and they are built on top of the I-95 freeway. This is what those buildings look like. They're 4 identical buildings, and they're very tall. And researchers went in and wanted to see whether the difference in noise level in these different units as you went up to, or different apartments as you go up to the 32nd floor, mattered in any material way for people. So they measured the noise levels at these different levels from the first floor all the way up to the 32nd. At the first floor, the noise, as you'd expect, was akin to having a truck going by all the time. 86 decibels is about that level, which is distressing. At the 8th level, the noise was lower. It was like having a vacuum cleaner on the whole time, which in research that we've done looking at annoying noises is one of the most annoying noises. We use that to induce aversive reactions, to put people through aversive experiences. They listen to a vacuum cleaner noise. At the 20th floor, it's more like the hum you get from a busy department store, which is a bit less aversive. And then at the very top floor, it's like, a family by the fireside, the gentle crackling of the fire. It's a much more manageable noise. And so there's a very big difference between the first floor and the 32nd. So should this matter, or does this matter? It turns out it does. One thing to note is that the degree of noise that you get from the top there is 1/10 as intense as the noise that you get from the bottom. So there's a very big difference in the intensity of the noise. So one thing they thought was, well, we need to be able to hear better when we're young to pick up the differences in words. When you're learning vocabulary, that's very important. And there are certain sounds in the English language that are especially hard to distinguish. So what they did was they found some people who lived in these towers who had children, and they asked them to do a sound discrimination test. So they had them hear the word beer or gear, and they asked them which word it was. That's hard to distinguish. Or rope and robe. And what they found was the kids who lived lower down did much worse at this. They did very well at the top. They all scored about 100%. But then as you went down, they did a little bit more poorly until at the bottom here on the 8th floor, they didn't look at the first floor because it was so noisy they just wanted to keep that out of it. But even at the 8th floor, these kids were doing a lot more poorly. It seemed as though their hearing had been badly affected. And when you look at their reading ability as a result, and they controlled for how wealthy these kids were. You might imagine wealthier people live higher up so they're better educated or something like that. That wasn't the case. If you scale the scores on these tests, kids at the top scored 100, kids on the 20th floor scored 93 on reading, and the kids on the 8th floor scored 87. So the noise had profound effects on their ability to read. Except if they'd been there for less than 4 years, because then their scores were almost indistinguishable, 100, 99, and 98. So the idea is if you're around this sort of noise for a long time, that's problematic. But if you move quickly enough, that's okay. You'll overcome that problem. And so the noise has profound effects, including how well kids learn to read. And so in an age where we have tiger parenting and helicopter parenting and this very serious attempt to control a whole lot of features of children's lives, things as seemingly immaterial as whether there's a pot plant in the home or whether kids are playing outside a lot or whether that you live high up or low down or near a noisy road, have often bigger effects than some of these very targeted interventions, like sending kids for tutorials and classes and extra lessons. So I think there are some pretty profound effects there. So what I've shown you now is, this is the table of contents of the book. I talked a little bit about names to begin. Then I moved on to talking about the characteristics of other people, where I talked about attractive women in chess, and then finished with locations, looking at nature and noise. And there's some other stuff there. I'm happy to chat about it if any of this seems interesting. And thank you very much for having me. Do we have time for some questions? Yeah? Yeah.
Regarding the effect of color on people.
Yes.
In, let's say, sports. So if you and I are playing tennis, does it benefit you more if you're wearing red or if I'm wearing red?
If there's an umpire, it's especially important to be the one wearing red, because you look more dominant and aggressive. Less so for tennis. Tennis is not the example that's probably best to illustrate the effect, but if you're playing, do you know the Olympic results? Do you know the effect?
No, I was thinking of an English football club. But
yeah, so Liverpool, Manchester United. It really matters. In the Olympics, what happens is people, when they're in combat sports, like taekwondo, judo, wrestling, each bout they get randomly drawn to wear red or blue. It turns out that whether they're drawn to wear red or blue really matters. And it matters for two reasons. One is that you feel more aggressive and dominant when you wear red. There's pretty good evidence for that. But more than that, when referees are grading you and they're giving you points, they will watch the same match, and then they've actually done this. They've switched the uniforms digitally, and they watch the same match where the blue and the red have been switched. They will award the same match to different people depending on who wore red. So it really does matter. I'm not sure about tennis. I mean, if you're wearing red in tennis or soccer, you probably look more dominant. Maybe that helps. But in hockey, if you wear black, a lot of the uniforms, when they change to black uniforms, some teams have done this in the past, the rate at which they're called for penalties skyrockets. So that's another concern. You look dominant, but you also look more aggressive. So some really interesting effects in the domain of sport. Yeah.
It seems like there's a difference between like having red and pink. So you have this whole thing with where you have the red, you're dominant, but the pink pacifies. Well,
yes.
Is there there's like a reason for that? That it's just the shade of basically the same color?
Yeah, it is just basically the same color. There was a great article a few years ago questioning whether pink was actually a color, because pink is essentially red. But it's indistinguishable in its physical properties, but it's watered down a little bit. That's why I think a large part of this is the association. So red we associate with the rush of blood that comes from aggression and anger and dominance, and in a romantic context, turns out you are more likely to attract a mate on online dating sites if you wear red. Again, because the rush of blood that's associated with red is supposed to signal a sexual interest. So I think the main difference there for me is associational. And it's not the physical properties of the color. And that's a good reason to believe that, I think. Yes?
Have there been any studies on like non-human, like animals, for instance, on the effect of color and their behavior? Like, is this something that transcends like species and
yes.
cultural norms and makes sense for
Yeah, I think the color chapter is the one that resides most squarely in biology and in evolution. And it's true about a lot of animals. I start by talking not about humans when I talk about red, but about other animals. There are a lot of species that show their dominance by having either a redder face, or when they get angry they go red, or when they're in heat they turn red. And so red is particularly important in the animal kingdom. To some extent it also changes how much you'd like to eat food. So some colors signal to us that the food is ripe for eating, and I think other animals make use of that information as well. So definitely, it's not just about humans, it's about other species as well. Yes?
Is there also like a capability of turning off the effect if you're conscious of it, or is it just so overwhelming that like you just cannot avoid it?
Yeah, this is a good question about everything in the book. And some effects, psychologists talk about discounting, the ability to discount the effect if you know that it's there. Some of these effects, there's an obvious way to discount them. And others, there just isn't. It's tapping into something biological, and even though you know it's there, you can try and fight it, but somehow it's probably still going to interact with your judgment. I try to spell that out, and I think it's the biological effects that are the hardest ones to overcome. But of course, if you're a referee and you're watching a match and there's someone wearing blue and someone wearing red, you might just say to yourself, I'm going to do everything I can to minimize my attention to the red and But how do you do that? It's just really hard to see how you would do it in an effective way. Sometimes what we end up doing, unfortunately, is overcorrecting or over-discounting, where you, no matter what the person wearing red does, you assume you're seeing them as dominant because they're wearing red. So it is a very tricky issue, and sometimes that makes the recommendations that flow from this stuff a little bit complex. Yeah.
What are your thoughts about applying signaling to maladaptive computer behavior? So you've talked a lot about color, but in order to have an effective signaling to the subconscious for maladaptive, so not covering for the normal use, but more for the abnormal use.
Yeah, so people have asked a lot of questions about how we can apply this to interfaces and computer screens. There's some great research showing that different colors make a wait seem more or less long. So when people are waiting for a web page to load, some colors signal to them that they haven't waited as long as others. If you make the page red, they'll think they've waited for longer, for example. So there is some interesting research looking at how we can make people better consumers of digital information based on the colors that we use and various other signals. So there's certainly some of that as well. Yes?
Do you have any information on extraneous factors affecting people's credulity? I work in security, and I'm trying to figure out how to help people not fall prey to social engineering attacks like, install this free antivirus software. Sure it will.
So I've done some research on this, and one of the factors that really matters, I talked about disfluency in names, that some names are harder to pronounce than others. If you make the interface disfluent, people are less likely to share stuff about themselves. And the one domain we looked at was an online anonymous confessions website. And the website changed its format. It was a very disfluent format for a while, and then it went to a fluent format. And people were much more willing to share stuff about themselves when it went to the fluent format. And we've got a lot of lab experiments as well that isolate that feature. That disfluency makes you feel like something's not right. I need to recruit extra mental resources. I need to be a little more vigilant, think a little more carefully. Something doesn't seem quite right here. And so if you can somehow encourage that information to be processed less easily, it sends up alarms for people.
Do fun with colors, like here's content from someone we don't know whether to trust or not. Can the operating system put a big red box or a big pink box around it to manage whether people will trust it?
Absolutely. In fact, there was a study that showed recently that you could take very unhealthy food and put a green label on it and people think it's healthy. That's very recent. And so the associations we have with these colors are very powerful. And I think red, it makes a lot of sense. There's already a lot of the use of red. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Do you have an idea between how many of these cues are biological and how many are cultural? Because it seems like there is a feedback loop. Like you said, Barack, at the beginning it wasn't that fluent, but it creates fluency by itself. Mm-hmm. Same thing about these effects, right? As we go into, they became more...
Yeah. I don't think it's fruitful to try to pass out the separate contributions. So if we look at red and the biology of red for mating and courtship behavior, I think the ultimate origin of the red effect is biological. I think that animals recognize in other animals sexual interest by their faces being more flush. But we know that if you look at Valentine's Day and the femme fatale and the red dress and all of that stuff, that's all probably an outgrowth of this biological effect. And as you say, there's a feedback loop. And so now to know whether it's the biological effect that's operating or the association that came from that original biological effect, it's really hard to know. But I think both are operating in a lot of these cases. Not all of them. Like the color blue makes us more, it's the world's favorite color. Almost every country in the world likes blue more than other colors. That's true of people across the world. And I think that's because of the association we have for a lot of reasons. Yes?
What's the most neutral colors, meaning there's no effects?
It's a great question. I haven't found one yet that has no effects. So even shades, black, white, and grey have effects as well. The reason I say that is because we were trying to work out, well, if these sports uniforms, red and blue, are so powerful, and black is so powerful, what can we do? There isn't a really great answer except to say have one that's a slightly darker grey than another, which would be very boring to watch. It would take us back to the black and white age of black and white TV, and it would change the nature of the game, I think, quite dramatically. But there isn't a good answer to that. Did you have some online?
Yeah, I'm going back to names. So there was a positive association for women's names that are also used for men. Is there a different association for men whose names are associated with?
Yes, yes. The two big dimensions in human social interaction are warmth and competence. The ideal is to find someone who is both warm and competent, which means that they're warm, their intentions toward you are good, and they're competent, they're able to make those intentions a reality. The femininity of the name weighs heavily on the warmth component, I would argue. And so if you name a boy when he's born something very masculine and give him a middle name that's something like Maluma, that might be effective. Capture all the domains if you can. And a friend of mine has named his daughter with a fairly strong, independent first name, and her middle name is Maluma. So people do use this stuff. They take it pretty seriously.
Well, I wanted to mention that there's still some $10 books available if anyone's interested. And thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be signing books afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you.